Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the City Till We Die podcast for a 2025 recap. I'm not sure it's going to be a particularly fun one. You join myself, Ben Ambrose, my co-host Adam Harvey, and we tried to get everyone else on, but they just said no. So we've got Connor on as our first guest on this channel. So, that's a privilege for you to bestow. Mr. Southwell, first and foremost, Mr. Harvey. How the devil are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, fully sort of recovering from all the festivities, but I'm delighted to be back on this channel discussing the emotions that Norwich City put us through.
Mr. Southwell, same question. How you feeling? Are you I can imagine you're probably quite high on chocolate and sugar, aren't you?
That's just every day, really. Not really just because of Christmas. With my sweet tooth, to be honest. But yeah, no, I'm well. I've just about got through it. Play the world's smallest violin, but as Adam well knows, this is a very busy period for us. So it's the songs they know it's Christmas time. It's you could easily make a version of that for sports journalists, I think. So, but yeah, all good and looking forward to hopefully a bit of a better 2026.
So just for a small dollop of context, the plan here is we're going to have a little look back at 2025. It will probably take, I don't know how long it'll take, but I think for us it'll feel like forever. We're then going to talk a little bit about where we are now and then try and be positive and try and give us some sort of reason to be hopeful for 2026. Chaps, first and foremost, 2025. Oh dear. Not a fun year for Norwich City. Ups and downs, far more downs than ups. Just a really, I think the problem with 2025 is it's so difficult to almost understand it because it's not like it was an absolutely diabolical year and it wasn't a brilliant year. It's almost in the middle of, there were almost green shoots at times, but equally it very much was a case of one step forward, two steps back. Adam, I want to turn to you first. Norwich City started the year with a win away at Luton, a goal from that man who shall not be named. They signed Jurasek, McConville, Slimani. That's how Norwich City's year started. I almost want you to compare it to how you feel now, but what do you make of that early spell of 2025? And please draw a comparison to now.
Yeah, I think at that point I was somewhat more upbeat. Obviously, Norwich had kind of a difficult autumn period, but that sort of run around Christmas last year with the win over Millwall on Boxing Day, they've got that late draw at home to QPR, just the game before the turn of the new year, and then going away to Luton and a game that wasn't, one for sort of highlight reels for the future watching, but it was a job well done. They got the win, a bit of a snatch and grab with the late goal from Nunez, as we well know, and I think that was probably the point where I felt, they could kick on a bit. There was sort of the hype, I guess, around maybe potential signings in January, a certain Mate Jurasek coming in and kind of what he might add to the squad that Janisław Torup had at the time. And yeah, obviously things started to rapidly decline as we sort of moved through the early parts of 2025. But yeah, as compared to where we're at now, it kind of feels like much of the same, really. Just kind of muddling along, highs and lows, peaks and troughs, as you sort of said at the top. And yeah, let's hope that it's going to be a slightly more positive 2026 than maybe the sort of start of 2025.
It feels strange, doesn't it, talking about or just mentioning Janisław Torup, because it feels like more than, what is it, 6-7 months ago, than when he was sacked, because it's just the brutal nature of football. Time doesn't work the same in football than it does outside of it. And it feels like just an eternity ago that we were discussing the project. And one of my notes here is the fact that I think the sacking of Thorup was the first time sort of Ben Napper almost flinched at the size of the task in terms of directing Norwich City. Connor, that first sort of block of 2025, I feel like, and this is a beautiful thing called hindsight, I feel like it was the turning point of that performance level, because with Thorup at the beginning, it was very, this is exciting, lots of goals, games almost on a knife's edge, entertaining. We were happy compared to what we'd seen for the previous, 2-3 years. But despite picking up some results, you look at Coventry, that really special game that, despite all of the context of this year, I still remember really fondly. That first block of games, even a 5-1 against Swansea at home, I remember leaving that game going, that was crap. Yet we walked away having scored, what was it, 5 second half goals. What did you make of that block? And do you think it's fair to say that that was a sign of things to come for the rest of the year?
Yes and no, because I think again some of the decisions that have been made probably later in the year have brought us to where we are now from a Norwich City perspective. But yeah, I think at the start of the year, I kind of felt it was what it was, which is a team and a club deeply in transition that was trying to find out whether this new way was going to be successful, probably how to implement it. A young coach who had shown us some very, very good things and continued to show us some good things in that year. I even go to Watford away, which I think was February the 1st, where they won 1-0 and got a clean sheet. And it was a very different type of victory than what we've been used to under Johannes Torup. And there was a moment at the end where the away fans were basically trying to get Johannes Torup to conduct some sort of celebration because they wanted that feeling of connection with him. So, yeah, it was a really strange start to the year. I remember working late on deadline day and basically expecting nothing to happen. And then obviously the Jacob Wright stuff kicked off late, and that was very exciting. That felt like a really interesting signing. Rory McConville, who we'd seen in the FA Cup, likewise. I remember actually last Christmas, as in 2024, writing the first story about Matej Jurasek. So that shows sort of where we were at. And I think there was a lot of excitement still about what the Johannes Torup era could look like. There were some wins towards the end of the year, the 6-1 against Plymouth and other ones as well that offered a lot of encouragement, because when it was good, it looked brilliant and it was so entertaining. But yeah, it was probably the inconsistency, wasn't it, at that stage between results and performances. And you mentioned a few there. And I think when you look back now at that Coventry game, that felt like it should have been and could have been a real moment, and one that, people hung on to and felt like a real turning point. And actually, I think that turning point probably came a couple of months later at Blackburn, where Antti Sienat scored late, and I think they were either on the cusp of or going into the top 6 at that stage. And obviously then Marcelino Nunez and Borja Sainz decided to muck around essentially in the final moments. Norwich lost the ball, Blackburn got up the other end, score. And I remember actually coming out that day of the tunnel to speak to Johannes Torup, and he was out there before us, which is quite rare, and he was just stood in his technical area basically looking up to the sky, and 10 games later he was gone. So that felt like the kind of turning point for me. If we were going to pin it on an exact game, an exact moment, it would have been that Andy Weimann header at Blackburn, because I still think without that, and Norwich win that game, Antti Sienat's being the hero, I think this year probably looks and feels drastically different than what it's ended up looking as, to be honest.
I think you're bang on with the Blackburn game. That was, I mean, it really was just an absolute sucker punch. The feeling after that was horrible. And there are the parallels there with now and Preston and the game not being entertaining, but Norwich City getting themselves into a position where they should win. Norwich City have done that a couple of times under Clement, haven't they? Where on the balance of the game, you think, it's quite even, but they get themselves to a position where they should go and win it, and then they don't. And what I'm sat here hoping, as you say that, Connor, is, God, I hope the pressing game isn't that. Which I don't think it will be, for the record. But I'm just trying to pick out some sort of memorable things from that block. We'll call it sort of January to when Thorup was sacked. As you mentioned there, Connor, Watford away, the dark arts, that famous Tom Cleverley quote where head loss was at a maximum. Sadly, Norwich couldn't tap back into that. I think we've seen it a little bit under Clement where they've tried to, but again, it's just not quite happening. I'd love to see its return, but Thorup being sacked, the first major event of the year. Adam, are you still like me? Are you still fairly hung up on it? Because I do still feel quite damaged by it. If Manning was still in charge and we were, well, where we still are, to be fair, but playing as we were, I think I would be bright red right now, almost in tears, thinking, oh my God, how's this happened? But do you feel like that is sort of a chapter that is now fully closed and we can fully move on from?
Yeah, I think the sort of more recent weeks under Clement has maybe sort of started to, sort of turn the attention a little bit away from Johannes Torup, who I think was certainly kind of at the front of most of people's minds when Liam Manning was in charge, and the football, wasn't pretty to watch. The results were poor. And yeah, I think a lot of people maybe felt that in hindsight, keeping hold of Yanisov Torup and maybe some of the positives that we were starting to see within that early part of 2025, but certainly kind of that sort of purple spell, I guess, at the back end of 2024, where the football was good to watch. It was attacking, it was exciting, lots of goals. But then there was that kind of other side of it, which, you know, that Sheffield Wednesday game at home will always sort of scar me from the early part of 2025. You know, Norwich 2-0 up, playing really, really well in the first half, and just to fold like a pack of cards and capitulate the way they did in the second half is kind of almost, sort of barometer for what kind of ended up becoming the end of Johannes Torup's tenure. And then there was sort of the intriguing element, you know, which I'm sure we're about to talk about, is kind of the Jack Wilshere little sort of spell in charge, and maybe kind of the split opinion, I guess, on whether he could be the man to have led Norwich City forward. And I remember that sort of spell being quite an eventful period with everything that went on. And I think certainly within the football club, maybe apart from sort of Ben Napper and those above him, you know, Johannes Torup was probably the man that most people felt was going to be back in the summer, and there was going to be sort of a transfer window, and it was almost going to be, look, season 2, almost Daniel Farker-esque. Look, let's hope we can sort of see the story start to unfold in the way we all hoped it would. But that wasn't the case, and that decision, even to this day, you know, is probably one of the sort of very rare occasions I would say I was sort of partially shocked to sort of see and hear the news when he was sacked, because typically, you know, you either kind of expect the manager to be on their last legs, or maybe they get poached, and there's kind of all the rumours around it. But that was probably the one where, yeah, split opinion a little bit more than most.
Before we move on from Thorup, and because I do want to touch on that sort of weird little Jack Wilshere bubble that we sat in for a couple of games and, well, quite a few weeks really. Connor, what do you make of, because the last point on Thorup is almost the picking up and the moving of the goalposts, and the project drastically changing from time and patience into we need to pick up some results. We've heard various stories, heard interviews from Thorup himself where implications that are almost fairly strong to infer what he's trying to say really wasn't difficult. And clearly, I think the narrative is Thorup was promised this, and by the end was being told to do that. How do you reflect on that? Because it was a pretty significant part of this Norwich City journey this year, and this Ben Napper tenure.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say first and foremost, and I remember going live, I think it might have even been with you, Adam, on the day, and I thought it was the wrong decision then. I still think it's the wrong decision now. The timing of it was odd, two games before the end of the season. I think they could have muddled through. They weren't in any danger of relegation. They weren't going to get promoted. Was it ideal? No, but I think at that point, there were always grumblings, right, around managers and when you're in that run of form. But I wouldn't say the groundswell of opinion was that Johannes Torup should have gone. It felt, you know, me and Adam again were at that Millwall game, and it was more directed at the players, and I felt some of them did down tools in that period over the Easter weekend, where they obviously lost badly to Portsmouth and then against Millwall as well. As for him and I guess the moving of the goalposts, I think whether they did or whether they didn't is irrelevant. The fact he felt that probably is the most concerning sign. And you know, he made some comments about the communication generally and about how it sort of tailed off towards the end. And those are the aspects for me that are most concerning, and that there are always two sides to the story. The truth is often somewhere in the middle with these things. And you know, the reality is, and I know because I've spoken to some of them, and in terms of Torup in and around that place, I think by the end the mood was pretty poor, and I don't think he necessarily commanded a lot of support. But then on the flip side, I remember that first year under Daniel Farker, where there were a lot of players who just didn't agree with the methods, didn't like the changes in terms of training, and they were pretty strong personalities. And for me, Norwich and Ben Napper probably more specifically needed to be stronger and needed to back Johannes Torup in that period. I accept the point in terms of, you know, was his management the best? But then if he had a group of players, a lot of which he thought weren't going to be there for the long term, it doesn't make it right. But you can understand it on a human level as to why. And again, maybe that is something that could have been addressed over the summer. So for me, it kind of felt like taking a sledgehammer to a peanut. Really, would be kind of the way I would describe it. And I would have liked to have seen them just dig their heels in a little bit and be a bit more stubborn with it. And you know, for me, it comes down to something, you know, I heard ages ago in football, which is if something's going badly wrong, you change the coach or you change the players. And in the summer, Norwich did both. And I think that's partly why they've got to where they are, because of this kind of confliction and lurch and handbrake turn constantly between coaches and playing styles. And and ideas. And it felt to me like if there was been one coach this year that they probably really should have got behind. Yeah, of course, Philippe Clement now, but obviously if you're going to pick him and Liam Manning, I think for me it was Johannes Hoff-Torp. That was the one to really buy into and get to. So yeah, look, it's a shame. It shouldn't have ended as messily as it did. I still think some of the best football I've seen at Norwich in my lifetime came under Johannes Hoff-Torp in very, very small bursts in games. But then equally, some of the defending was probably the worst I'd seen, and that fluctuation was too great. I think what I would say generally is that, and again, I know people don't, or not all people like kind of the numbers and the metrics, but the underlying numbers weren't bad. For example, Norwich's defensive record, if you go on underlying numbers in XG and stuff like that, was better than Bristol City's, and yet they hired the coach who had that worse record. So, I think it probably speaks to the wider muddle that they got themselves into. If I'm being completely honest, the timing was odd. I thought the decision generally was odd, and it just felt quite sad because there'd been a lot of capital, not just that the club had put in, but I think that fans had put in emotionally to Johannes Hoff-Torp and the idea of what he was trying to build. And I think we saw at times in that season, even late on, there was a win against West Brom, and they still wanted a celebration with him. There was that real desire to connect with him, and it kind of felt like the club gave up on that probably a lot. Maybe Ben Napper specifically gave up on that a lot sooner than everyone else did. And I think that to me feels like the shame, because this season I don't think Norwich would be in the position they were in if Johannes Hoff-Torp was still in charge. And yeah, I just don't think they gave that enough time. Ultimately, can anyone really say if it would have been a success? No, they can't. And I think that for me is the biggest shame on the whole thing.
Before we move on, the most frustrating thing for me and the hill that I'm just so willing to die on is the case study is there for Norwich City to see the personal experience for us. And it's not like it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. You had Daniel Farke, 5, 6 years ago, walk through the door, have what I think was a worse first season than Thorpe in terms of digesting the football and looking to get behind something. I genuinely I strongly disagree with any notion that it's revisionism, but I much preferred watching Thorpe's team than Farke's in their first season. And to have that history lesson there, and to just not use it as almost just some sort of courage to stick by your guns, blows my mind. And for me, when we get onto Ben Napper, because we are going to talk about Ben Napper, and to be honest, opinions for me and I think for Adam and maybe for you as well, Connor, the opinion remains the same of he's got to go. And you tend to have to judge people based off of how they react to adversity and disappointment in football. Like you can look at positives all you like, but for me, character, leadership and strength is shown when times are tough, and Ben Napper folded, as you said, Adam, and crumbled, and just, as you said, Connor, almost redirected things and took a sledgehammer to a peanut, and we will get onto that. But moving on, Adam, talk to me about the Wilshere tenure. A weird period for Norwich. How did you feel like things were going to go from then? Because it almost felt at a certain point that it was certain he'd be Norwich City's head coach.
Yeah, I know when he was appointed, there was kind of the hype and the excitement of a big name player who, is kind of well renowned across world football coming into the coaching department at Norwich City, and much was maybe made about the fact Johannes didn't have any of his own people within that coaching sort of group, and Jack Wilshere was almost seen as kind of an understudy and someone who maybe in the long term might potentially replace Johannes Hoff-Torp if, he got poached, because I think that was probably the view more than he would be sacked, when he certainly the early parts of the season and what was being shown on the football pitch at Carrow Road, it was exciting and the fans bought into it. But I remember that sort of opening press conference when Jack Wilshere walked in, and there was that sort of swagger and that demeanour. And just kind of the way he spoke, you sort of sat there and thought, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, this is someone, who knows the game inside out, having played it. Obviously, still early in his coaching journey, but you kind of wanted it to work out well for him, because he seemed like a really genuine bloke. And, I remember him sort of walking in the room and shaking everybody's hands. And, it was kind of that personable element, which, obviously the fans wouldn't be privy to, but, I think does go a long way, certainly in kind of sports journalism world, because there is managers that make it difficult, as Connor will well know, with questions and maybe not sort of wanting to answer things. But I thought, Jack Wilshere was fairly open on that, and you certainly felt like he believed that he had the job. And that Middlesbrough performance. I remember that day, I think Coventry had lost to Luton in the early kickoff, and there was kind of that feeling around the Riverside that it was the big game and that Middlesbrough needed to win, and Norwich went there and just really frustrated them. And, Jack Wilshere made some sort of tweaks to the system and the formation. I remember Jack Stacey playing as a winger, and everybody was like, "Oh, I'm not really sure that's going to work." But for that one game, it seemed to have a positive effect, and Norwich got the result they required. I mean, the Cardiff game was kind of a little bit more of a sort of end of season sort of dead rubber, as I suppose it's sort of coined. Cardiff already
Charity match.
Yeah, pretty much that. And Norwich sort of waltzed their way to it, but yeah, I still remember kind of the sort of feeling that it was going to be Wilshere, and then walking into sort of the post end of season, sort of sit down with Ben Napper, and he sort of unveiled to us that it wasn't going to be Jack Wilshere. And, I think as much as maybe part of me felt that it wouldn't be him, there was kind of that growing feeling, I think, in the days before that it was going to be him. So, yeah, an interesting time in Norwich City's sort of 2025 history, I guess, and one that feels like a long time ago, yet wasn't all that long ago.
So moving on, Jack Wilshere doesn't get the job. Liam Manning, there's that short list, isn't there? Manning, Linders, O'Neill. So they're the three. It was much like the process for hiring Thorpe. You hear all these names on Twitter, and then someone reveals to someone that there is a list of three, and we all do our research into the three candidates, and very much it felt dead set on Manning this time around. With Thorpe, it was a little bit more ambiguous and a bit more like, oh, is it going to be him? Is it going to be him? But with Manning, it felt like a case of when, not if, and that proved to be the case. A 4-year deal was dished out by Ben Napper, one of his favourite things to do. Loves a 4-year deal, that man. Connor, with hindsight, it feels like the fabric of the deal it made sense because Liam Manning had taken a Bristol City team that probably on paper wasn't amazing. I don't think it was bad, but it wasn't amazing. And he finished 6th of them in the Championship. Norwich City have that experience of finishing in that position in the league with a squad that personally for me on paper better than that Bristol City squad, but plays football in a way that's a bit like, oh, should they be there? How do you reflect on, just to kick things off about Liam Manning, God knows how long this will go on for, how do you reflect on that initial period of Liam Manning? Because there was such a, and sorry to the person who says my question like always take too long, but it's just another one of those questions. But it felt like with Manning, and I remember sort of watching Napper and Manning almost giggle amongst each other when asked about Harry Darling. It felt like two mates who were feeling quite smug and, looking back on it, almost borderline arrogant about how this was certainly going to work and how the work that Thorpe had put in was going to be turned into this certain playoff finish. What do you make looking back at that initial period of, again, as you said, new players, new coach?
Yeah, I think, I'm not going to sit here and say I thought it was a terrible appointment and I thought it was totally wrong, because that's not true. I think if you look at all of the factors behind that decision, I think there's still very much some sound logic behind it in terms of what did he have that Thorpe didn't. Well, he had championship games behind him. He had a track record of success in the championship. I never really agree with that, because if we're talking about getting a team into the top 6, I don't really quantify that as success, because if you get absolutely battered in the playoffs, as Liam Manning did, as David Wagner did as Norwich manager, you might as well finish 8th. I mean, there's no real difference, to be honest. So, but I understand conventionally that was success and definitely overachieved in that. He was a manager on the up, all of that sort of stuff. So there was, relatively experience of, it depends how you define it. Was it attractive football? Maybe not, but definitely effective football. And I remember going to Ashton Gate towards the back end of last season, and the way that they pressed Norwich and tactically outfought Norwich, really, Thorpe's Norwich team was really impressive, and the variety they had in their game. And that was only the one-off game. The Carrow game was slightly different because Norwich had so many injuries, but he was the first coach to win there for a year, and that's obviously still his last win. So, yeah, I think the science behind it, if you want to use that, was sound, and the logic was sound. He ticked a lot of boxes, and you know, if he was still available in the searcher post Liam Manning, and he was still at Bristol City, and he was still doing that job, I think he still would have been one of the contenders for the job this time around. So I think it's easy to be a revisionist about it, but yeah, clearly, and this is an understatement, it didn't work out as anyone intended, and it was a disaster. I think for me at the time, the only thing I would say that wasn't hindsight is I did have concern over whether the person and how much of an effect this had. Only he would be able to answer, but there was obviously so much that had gone on in his life, very, very tragic, horrendous stuff around obviously the death of his son. And you just wonder about, you know, how much of an effect that had, because naturally it puts life into perspective for everybody when you have a tragedy of that magnitude. And yeah, I wonder if in hindsight he would do anything differently. But again, I don't think he could have turned down the Norwich job in his position. I do wish, and this is something I said from the start, because it was made clear to us, and it was clear in that opening press conference, that he didn't really want to be drawn on the Norfolk links and that kind of homecoming connection. I think he should have amped that up. It was such an easy win for him, such an open goal, and he just didn't take it. And it felt like from that point, Pitt really was on the back foot, and obviously pre-season was a mess, and it just felt like he was playing catch-up and probably never really got a break. But equally, yeah, there was some stuff in there that clearly, in terms of the schedule and the training plans, was also left a lot to be desired. So, I mean, yeah, in a word, disastrous, wasn't it, from start to finish, really?
Adam, for all the talk of the change of head coach, which again is a significant thing, lots of players were signed in that summer transfer window. Connor, you mentioned pre-season being a mess and the disorganisation. Would you argue that that level of lack of planning really applies to the signings as well? Because it's a point we've made a lot this season, that Ben Napper has assembled a squad that doesn't really have a balance and doesn't make the most sense for what we expect. With, you know, what are we now? 4 or 5 months down the line into the season, how do you reflect on those transfers, and do you still feel there's potential?
Yeah, certain sort of individuals I think have certainly stepped up. Well, since the arrival of Clement, really, you kind of look at that whole Liam Manning spell, and I don't really think there's an argument for many of the players to really sort of say that they met the kind of, I guess, the hype when they signed, or maybe sort of started to fulfill those potentials. You know, certain individuals maybe showed flashes of brilliance. You know, I know me and you have maybe sort of highlighted our liking and love for Pelle Matson long before maybe some people have started to see his quality in recent weeks. But even, you know, sort of him, it was kind of difficult trying to make a case for him as an individual being a good signing and someone who, you know, could be sort of put in the tick category, I guess, for Ben Napper recruitment, because we hadn't seen it enough and not consistently enough. Where now we are starting to see that on a weekly basis, game by game basis, and I think there is a bit more of an argument for the likes of, you know, Makama has started to show his sort of goal threat and his quality, as much as there's still, you know, some raw elements in his game and there's stuff to still improve. He's a player who has certainly stepped up since the arrival of Clement. But yeah, I think Liam Manning, I felt that whole transfer window was a little bit bizarre. You know, you kind of had the Harry Darling signing, which I felt they needed to do more of for Liam Manning, signing a few more players, probably homegrown players he'd worked with previously, and players that maybe would fit into what he wanted to do and sort of the system he was going to deploy. And instead, it felt like it was a bit of a muddle. You know, some players that were maybe more aligned to what Johannes Torp would have wanted from players. And yeah, looking back now, I think if Ben Napper maybe could have done that window and maybe the recruitment team behind the scenes a little bit differently, then I think they probably would have. Whether that would have changed the outcome and the picture for Liam Manning and the season that Norwich have had and the way it's unfolded, maybe not. But yeah, hindsight is a wonderful thing.
It feels like Ben Napper needs that arrogance that Stuart Webber had, where the dangerous thing is when things are going well, everything's rosy, the man's a genius. Oh wow, what personality he has. When things aren't going so well, the dead opposite. And for Ben Napper, things have never particularly gone well. I remember when Stuart Webber got appointed, and then subsequently Denzel Farker got appointed, and it was a case of, look, whoever I bring in as a head coach, I'm building a club here. I'm not building around an individual. that was kind of the standard that was set for us for that role. So I always felt like signings should be around an idea rather than a coach. But very quickly after Thorpe's dismissal and the signings that were made, like you said, it feels like players were signed for Thorpe specifically, not just a system, but for Johannes Thorpe. And that is just, again, almost building a game of Jenga out with all the points and things about Ben Napper and just, my feelings towards him. But yeah, I'm glad you got in nice and early. That we didn't have to die on the hill, thankfully, about Pelle Matson. Personally, I feel like there are players with potential, like you said, and I find it tricky because I think Norwich City and their recruitment team, led by Ben Napper, I think they can spot talent. And Connor, I know you said it on a lot of your media as well. This whole data debate, and I feel like it's calmed down a lot, is almost nonsense because Norwich City don't sign players purely based on numbers, and actually data is really helpful. Data is almost just a way to ring an alarm bell to go, all right, I'm going to have a look at him. Things are still done by people going and watching and using their eyes and sort of performing the famous eye test. And Norwich are in such a weird position at the moment where we just keep talking about potential, and I'm not bored of it, but it's getting a little bit jarring. It's getting a little bit tedious. And that potential was just sadly never fulfilled by Manning. Like you said, Con, I want to touch on it as well. What Manning went through, I just feel like as a human being at this point, I just want to say to him, like, just have a break, put your feet up, have a break. Because clearly, and it's something he said towards the end of his time at Norwich, he's someone who gets his head down and works and fights. And do you know what? I don't doubt that. And the evidence is there to see that actually for someone who didn't play at a particularly high level as a coach, I think he's achieved some impressive things. Especially, all sort of amounted to that Bristol City playoff finish, didn't it? And it felt like a case of he was leaving whilst his stock was high. And I understand that. It's not just football. You do that in any sort of career, in any industry. You're always trying to get a better job. You're always trying to cash in when you're worth just sort of the most amount of whatever currency your job is in. And it is a sad thing, as you said, Connor, that he didn't tap into that Norwich City connection towards the end. It almost felt like he tried to pull that back. A couple of those sound bites talking about how much the club means to him. Sadly, at that point, it was too far gone for him, and it felt on the nose. It felt like he was trying to pull the wool over our eyes, which in football, you very rarely see a manager come back from at one club, especially in modern football. You very rarely see a manager come back from what Liam Manning was going through at Norwich City. And for me, probably the most painful part of his tenure was, and we have to mention it, it was the loss to Ipswich. As a fan, Connor, how do you look back at that defeat? Because I feel like at the time it was just a bit like, oh, right. Because 16 years is a long time to go unbeaten against a local rival. Does it hurt at all still? Or is it just kind of like, all right, there you go, that's done, move on?
Yeah, it did. I think you always, because certainly probably in all of our lifetimes, really, that I didn't have that much consciousness of Ipswich Town beating Norwich. Certainly not personal experience. I was pretty young when it happened, maybe 8, I think. And so I heard it on a radio, and I knew you didn't, if you grow up yellow and green, you don't really like blue and white, but nothing beyond that. So I think throughout the years it rolled on, and game by game by game passed by. I think you do build it up, don't you, as a fan, and you do build it up maybe to be in this kind of awful end of the world experience. And what does the tomorrow look like after an East Anglian derby defeat? But actually, as it unfolded and the gulf between the teams was as clear as it was on that day, I didn't find it anywhere near as painful as I might imagined. And actually, to be honest, I didn't get the sense inside Portman Road there was that unkindled sense of joy that maybe that there has been from a Norwich perspective in years gone by, when maybe Ipswich, for example, the David Wagner one. And I felt similar when Norwich beat Ipswich with the Paul Lambert stuff. Of course, there was all of that kind of pantomime element. But even then, because of the state Ipswich were in, it wasn't really a competitive game. And that's when really the East Anglian derby wins a sweet to be honest. So, and I say that with, I know there'll be people say, "Oh, well, you are just saying that," but that's not the case. For me, I think probably the bit that irked Norwich fans the most was Marcelino Nunez and his role in it and around that decision. And I still think to this day, and it's a point I put to Ben Napper directly when I sat down with him. I still think that's the most damaging decision he's made as Norwich City sporting director, because park any business element to it. You just cannot ignore the fan sentiment and the fan feeling and the damage that sanctioning that deal does. And it creates, rightly or wrongly, I think Ben Napper does care huge amounts about Norwich City, but I think it creates a perception that he doesn't really understand the fan base, that there's a bit of a disconnect, and that he's a little bit cold and that he's a little bit ruthless and clinical. And that's kind of what it felt like at the time. And I think it's done, really, really bad damage in terms of his relationship with Norwich City fans, because, again, we're entering a January window now. Well, what if Ipswich Town come with 30 million for Josh Sargent? Well, Norwich would sell him. That's the precedent that they've set now, and that's a remarkable thing, really, to consider, particularly when you think about, Mark Ashton and his words, and, I get he's kind of playing up to it, but he was very strong on, you just don't sell, and you don't. So I think that was probably the most hurtful element of it all, watching somebody who was a Derby Day winner, who Norwich fans, they might try and claim differently now, but he was very popular at Carrow Road, was a creator of great moments, one of the players that was really joyful to watch. And to see him in blue and white, waving a flag around his head, inflicting on them a first Derby defeat in 16 years, that for me was the painful element. It wasn't the actual Derby defeat, it was more the role that he played in it. And that's a decision that I don't know if within some sections Ben Napper will be forgiven for in the mid to long term, to be honest.
What was Manning's saying? I was about credit in the bank, something like that. Ben Napper, I don't know what he's done to his bank account. It seems as if he was given a very large one, metaphorically, and has just chucked it away. If you want to stack up two piles of good things that Ben Napper has done and questionable / stupid / bad things, you've got a very just imbalanced set of whatever the hell you want to call it. Because and you're right, Connor, you're right, the Nunez decision is just the most bizarre one. I personally, I think the Thorpe sacking is the worst, but the Nunez one hurts the most. I have quite a, I think I have all Norwich City fans and probably the closest to Ben Napper in that I think I'd have made the same decision financially. And I don't use it as a stick to beat him with. I use all the other things, but I'm still as hurt by it. As you said, he was a popular figure. He wasn't just a popular figure, he's a bloody good footballer.
I think the one I would jump in on there, it's clear, and Mark Attanasio said this, they didn't need the money from it. So I would kind of have got that if we were in times of old and it was Delia and Michael. I don't think it gets sanctioned under them, by the way, is what I would say first and foremost.
I agree.
But equally, if you're in a self-financing era, then of course I think there is more reason to do that deal. But when your owner is as clear as he was that it was an own goal, that it essentially wasn't worth the hassle it created, and I agree, it isn't just £10 million, because what's £10 million to this ownership group? It is the long-lasting damage it does. And even now, when Ipswich Town are climbing the league and Marcelino Nunez is a prominent figure in that, and of course I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure there are clauses in that deal that would see Norwich in receipt of money if Ipswich get promoted. That all of that feels wrong, and it kind of goes against what I think fans are brought up with. And I think it's at that point where, if I was a fan, I'd kind of shrug my shoulders and go, what is the point of all this? Because if at the end of the day Norwich are producing players to sell to Ipswich Town, I think that leaves you in a bit of a problem as a football club generally, and that is kind of the decision that they have made. And what they are saying in sanctioning that is that Ipswich Town are and Marcelino Nunez's view were a more viable club to get to the Premier League than Norwich City were. And I think it was a huge problem in terms of optics and in terms of execution. And yeah, I think it still hurts, doesn't it, for people of a yellow and green persuasion. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Well, it was this year, wasn't it, that the Norfolk Holdings Group officially became the majority, was it the owners officially of Norwich City Football Club, and it was inevitable, wasn't it? And the direction of the club was clearly being led by them. And without really touching on that event specifically, I do want to talk about one man, and that is Mark Atanasio. And you chaps have met him, you've sat down with him, you've spoken to him on more than one occasion. Adam, the interview, we've got to mention it. I don't quite think it went as badly as it could have. But look, I mean, at time, let alone just sitting and having that time to reflect. What the hell was all that about?
Yeah, so that was a strange sort of time in, I think, Norwich City 2025 existence. Some of the sort of backing maybe for Liam Manning at the time, who, universally, I think majority, if not all of the fan base completely turned against. And yeah, just some very strange comments and sort of, yeah, I think that sort of, yeah, feeling, I guess, that maybe he's still learning on the job, which I think is fair. And, I think the morals and the kind of hopes and dreams for the football club are all positive, and I think that's been shown visibly. The backing maybe and some of the finances that Norwich have now got are in a different stratosphere completely to where they were at previously. And maybe it's more the trust he's been sort of placing upon certain individuals within the football club to exercise it and utilize that money, and trying to maybe get kind of more for that money, I guess. And that's where the problems and a lot of the questions are still at the moment. You look at kind of the squad that's at Clement's disposal, and as much as Tony Springett played well in the 45 minutes against Charlton in 2025, the fact that you're still relying on somebody like that to come and start games is concerning. And that's kind of where I think, if Norwich are going to try and progress and maybe achieve this goal of becoming a Premier League club, and a sustained one within 3 years, 5 years, whatever the sort of hopes and dreams were, which I think at the time, everybody was looking at thinking, okay, well, we're in the relegation zone here. We're probably on our knees the most this club's been since sort of the years of 2008, 2009, where if the squad built on loan players, the finances were difficult, and Norwich were in more than just trouble going down to League One. They were in big trouble as a football club entirely. Yeah, to make comments like that obviously don't sit well with fans, and realistically maybe makes you look a little bit, not deluded, but maybe a little bit stupid. And that's kind of, I think, where the learnings for Mark Atanasio as an owner, he'll learn from that, and hopefully, yeah, so sort of in the future maybe not make sort of similar mistakes, I guess.
I like that you held back from deluded and then changed to stupid. Yeah, fair enough. I think you're absolutely spot on with both words. The positive that I take is, he seems like a good bloke, and actually clearly is a very clever man. There's a reason that he's got into a position where he can buy this football club and fund it the way he is. And I don't really know why, but I feel like he will get us to where he needs to get us to. I feel like he's all in. I'm not going to say I trust him, but I'm still excited with him and his group as the owners of Norwich City. But that interview was not great at all. What was it? Ben needs Liam. Liam needs Ben. We're going to back Liam Manning. Manning gets sacked a couple of weeks, maybe even less than a couple of weeks later. Napa keeps his job. I'm just trying to think before we move on to the sacking. That probably is sort of everything until, like I said, Liam Manning was backed and then sacked. It should have happened sooner. Let's not get into that. Norwich City lose to Leicester. It felt like a significant game because Norwich took the lead at home, and it kind of felt like, oh, okay, we probably actually should be in the lead here. And I remember that goal going in from Fiskar in nearly on 70, and Carrow Road erupted, and there was a sense of relief. And that day at Carrow Road, I don't think that the fans had much to get behind, yet the atmosphere was really good. Liam Manning hadn't earned that level of support from the Norwich City fans, and being at Carrow Road randomly amidst a really turgid time, it just felt very different. And that goal went in, but then the trend reoccurred. Liam Manning was sacked, and we were back at square one. How do you reflect on that, Connor? Because we will move on to the Napa sort of whipping from every media outlet in the Norwich City sphere that you can think of. how do you reflect on the sacking and how it was dealt with, like from both your professional point of view? Because what is this now, your fourth or fifth sacking that you've seen, and you've really not been doing your job like that long in the grand scheme of life yet. It feels like every 6 months there's a new manager. How do you look back on that? And also,
Yeah.
is it your fault? Are you a curse? Is this your fault?
Well, yeah, quite possibly. Although I have got promotion on my CV, to be fair, but that was behind closed doors. So does that count? I don't know. But certainly, yeah, under fans, it's not been great. Yeah, so I'll go through it. What Farker, Smith, Wagner, Torup,
You're not going to
Manning.
like chuck in like Alan Russell on a technicality.
No,
there?
no, absolutely not. So yeah, so this is my sixth, I think, permanent boss, maybe seventh. Yeah, I think, and again, I don't say this with hindsight. I thought he should have gone after Ipswich. Was my view. I thought it got too bad, too sort of irreparable at that point, and performances got worse, and the trends were already pretty horrendous. I think I said after the third game, and I went quite early on it. It looked to me at fourth game that it looked like a really poor Championship side to me. And I was saying all the way until they eventually fell into the bottom three that I thought they would end up there if they persisted with what they were doing, and they did. And obviously they remain there now. So it's not something that just kind of fell upon them. It was blindingly obvious for weeks how bad they were, and in what a poor state they were, and how poorly coached they look as well. And I think that was probably the most surprising element of the whole Liam Manning era, because you think about his Bristol City team and they were anything but that. They were effective, they were multi-dimensional, they were clever. Sometimes they'd switch to a 4 and a 3, and they maybe didn't have the talent, maybe, but in terms of the overall cohesion and the way that they played, they got results. And it might not have always been the prettiest, and I know Bristol City fans were very vocal about his style of play, both when he joined and when they came to Carrow Road, but he got them into the top 6 by hook or by crook, and was the first person to do that in near on 20 years, I think. So you can't dismiss all of those things irrespective of how he got there. But I think it's a trend in football generally, and you see it. Spurs are a good example at the moment. If you go from someone that has a really clear style of play, everyone calls them stubborn, says they don't have a plan B and that you need a pragmatist. Then you appoint a pragmatist. Their teams aren't really good at anything, and people go, "Oh, we don't really understand what we're trying to do or how we're trying to play." So the truth is always a bit more middle ground, which I think is what Philippe Clement is in fairness. He doesn't strike me as someone that is completely ideologically wedded to something, but at the same token, there are principles and structures there. You can see that. So, yeah, look, it went on for too long, and the fact that he got, I think, another 6 games after Ipswich, and still left as Norwich's shortest serving permanent boss with the, I think, highest loss percentage and lowest win percentage. That sums it up. It was a disastrous period, really, and not all of it his fault, for reasons we'll get on to. And me and Adam were fortunate enough to go out to the Netherlands in the summer, which was that training camp, and I think even we felt a little bit exhausted by the end of it because of how long it was. But during that, we were fortunate enough to have a really good sit down for a couple of hours with Liam Manning, and I said this a few times. I thought he was a really good bloke, and a really pleasant bloke, and a good coach. And I think and I've said this a few times as well, the Liam Manning, and Adam can attest for it, that we saw on camera was very different to the one that I think we saw that day, but also even in the snippets before and after press conferences. And it's a shame that there wasn't more of that personality. I've said this a few times. I hope in the jobs that he's going to have in the future, we see a little bit more of that warmth and that sense of humour that he's got, actually, that we just did not see in public settings with him. But yeah, it was the right time. I really couldn't see how it could limp on. I mean, it's not just the defeat element to it. It was the protests outside the ground at both ends, players being blocked into the car park. I mean, I at the end of that Leicester game, I was setting up for my verdict, and the Norwich squad was getting frog marched round the pitch to a coach by police. That is just not a sustainable place to be. And as I said, that's not all on Liam Manning. It's a culmination of factors, but the head coach is often the thing that gets changed first. We know that, and I think it was probably too late, if anything, in the end.
I think he was just the victim, wasn't he, of the post frustration that started. I'm not gonna lie to you. I think it's when Buendia was sold. I initially have sort of thought to myself it was when Farker was sacked, but actually there was that few months before where Buendia was sold, and Farke almost had to change everything because he went. And that's my firm
Well,
belief.
I remember that summer. Adam would have been there as well, so I don't know if he does. But there was talk around that time in that summer that they wanted to change to a 4-3-3 and be a little bit different, and that was immediately a red flag. And then obviously the Buendia stuff happened as well. So yeah, I think there are various points that you can plot the downfall and the regression that they've gone through. But it's just that for me, it's the constant change and flip flop between ideas and coaches. You look at the coaches I've named there, Farke, very different to Dean Smith, who was very different to David Wagner, who was very different to Yannis Oftorop, who was very different to Liam Manning, who was very different to Philippe Clement. There is not a lot of threads really that push those guys together apart from their points of difference. And if you don't have that idea and that identity, and again, this is a point I put to Ben Napper as well, in that, you know, if you don't sell an idea well enough, if you don't bring people with you, and if you then don't have the courage of your convictions to enact that, and that's not just on him, because that was partly towards the end of the Stuart Webber era as well, where they started signing players who, you know, they had 11, 12, 30 plus year olds for a club that wanted to produce players and sell. It just didn't make sense, any of it. So yeah, there's loads that we can pinpoint, but I think where we are now in 2025 at the end of it is a culmination of all of those bad decisions and poor choices over a long period of time that have probably now come home to roost, and maybe all of the sticking plasters have been peeled off, and who knew, there's a big gaping wound there that Norwich City need to fill with something and treat pretty urgently.
There is a rumour that if you go into any gents toilet at a pub and you say Shane Duffy 3 times, he will appear. I'm scared to try that out, but I'm just putting that out there. It's such a shame to me that Leeds get to benefit from Daniel Farke's lessons in the Premier League. I literally remember talking to you about it, Connor, the switching to a 4-3-3 stuff, and I don't know, it's just, since that, for me, that Buendia sale is where I pinpoint the beginning of me going, oh my god, this is like, because that sale felt inevitable, and that was the shift in mindset. It wasn't like it was a shock sale. It was just, right, we're going to lose our best player, we're going to go into the Premier League, we're going to get relegated.
But I mean, what I would say, sorry to keep jumping in, but what I would say to kind of push back on the Farke stuff is that a lot of those players signed were ones that Farke wanted. Billy Gilmore, Daniel Farke wanted, and then decided that he couldn't really do what he wanted him to do. There were others in that summer as well. There were plenty of players that he recommended that didn't get signed. So it's I think it's too simplistic to say, oh well, you know, it was all imposed on Daniel Farke. That's not true. He did want a lot of those players and pushed for a lot. Josh Sargent was someone that he pushed for, which of course looks very different now, but at the time it wasn't quite what Norwich needed. So I think it's easy to kind of use the revisionism around it, but it was, yeah, like you say, we've probably seen now a coach who has learnt from some of those lessons, and it's been interesting to see some of those Leeds signings were players that he wanted at Norwich at the time as well. So yeah, all of that stuff is interesting, I think.
That's fair. To be honest with you, I meant Buendia specifically. I didn't mean to say everything was forced upon Farke. I remember the days of players signing and talking about the famous Farke phone call. Do you remember when that was the thing? I spoke to the head coach and he convinced me. Do you remember that just constantly being drip fed through interviews with players? And I remember Pierre Malou signing for Norwich and really being like, wow, you know, Daniel Farke must be an absolute charmer on the phone. We've not heard that since, have we? I'm kind of hoping we get back there with Clement, and when we sign players under Clement, it'll be, and hopefully there'll be some players where we look and go, oh, I'm surprised they signed, and then it's because of Clement. I miss that. I miss having a head coach that has a pull, and not that pull being Ben Napper and Liam Manning sort of giggling to each other about Harry Darling in a press conference. That's just not for me. We're talking about U-turns, and we're talking about lack of direction. We're talking about Norwich City not really knowing what they are and what they want to be. And have one of you said flip-flopping? I'm pretty sure we've said flip-flopping at some point. So we get to Philippe Clement, and it's another coach who, in terms of profile and background, is just another complete U-turn. You have the Thorup inexperience, idealistic, stubborn way of playing. You have the Liam Manning, you have the pragmatist, you have the domestic element, you have the, he's been there and done it in this division. And then you turn to Philippe Clement, who for me is actually the biggest name that I think, well, definitely in my lifetime, that Norwich City have appointed as a head coach. And I'd argue throughout their history, you look at his background and who he's managed, not just who he's managed, but what he's achieved with those teams. Norwich find themselves in a position where, for the third time in a calendar year, they've got a head coach and a very different set of players to try and achieve something with. And that leads us to where we are now, which I'd like to say is a slightly better position than, I mean, technically it's not, because Norwich City still sit where they sit in the table, and it's where they sat when Liam Manning was sacked. But by looking at them and actually results, I mean, technically, again, what was it, 3 wins in a row at Carrow Road, for Clermont, something Liam Manning couldn't even do once. How do you feel, Adam? We've seen enough of Clermont now, and I've almost been keen to get to the point now where we can reflect a little bit and have enough of a sample size to make that assessment of where we are and put that marker down. How do you feel about Clermont and his very brief spell so far?
Yeah, clearly from where he picked this Norwich City group up from, and a fan base that was disconnected. We haven't not even spoke about maybe the moving of the fans from the lower river end, and kind of the disconnect and anger and frustration that
Should we do that for
added.
half an hour? Should we do that?
Obviously, that added a bit more fuel on the fire away from just football, and what's happening on the pitch. So it was a club that was broken. It was a fan base that was angry and kind of wanted to kind of love their football club again. And I think he almost repaired that fairly quickly. I think the Birmingham away game, he almost got a little bit of a buy for, just in the fact that he was only in the building for a matter of days. And, at Norwich, as they always are, in a bit of an injury situation at that point, and he didn't have all the players he would want available to him. But over the period, I suppose, most frustrating thing is the fact they probably should and could have had more points quite plausibly. Some of the games you sort of look back on, and that Oxford game was probably the first one where it felt like everybody, first game, Carrow, for Clermont, there was kind of that excitement of like, what are we going to see? And as much as it wasn't a pretty game, the fact that Norwich were just a few minutes away from picking up that first win, it was like, oh, okay, that's kind of left you feeling a little bit flat. But then that QPR game was kind of a turning point, and I remember us doing a podcast after that, and it was kind of the first time we could really truly be positive. And as much as we didn't want to be too reactionary, I think slowly, as we've kind of moved over the piece in recent weeks, there has been enough positives there to believe and sort of feel that this group can get out of the situation they're in and quite comfortably move up the table. Clearly, once you get results like last night and the defeat against Watford, it does kind of knock your confidence a little bit, and it's almost that 2 steps forward and 1 back. However, again, I said, I'm not someone who's too reactionary about results, and I always kind of look more to the bigger picture and sort of what's maybe ahead. And I think there's opportunities for Norwich to take, and now it's about actually executing those, and maybe those late goals they just seemingly keep conceding. It's trying to sort of eradicate that, because if they can do that, then they will pick up more points than they currently are. And that's probably where the excitement is maybe for the future. I think if Clermont can just get them out of the situation they're in, keep them and steady them in the Championship moving into next season, then I think this summer and what potentially could be on the horizon for Norwich in 2026 and the 26-27 season could be exciting. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because the current situation is still bleak. But I think compared to where they were at, and certainly under Liam Manning, where it was a fractious feeling and everybody felt really disconnected and almost didn't want to go to Carrow Road, fans do want to go to Carrow Road again. You could see that last night. The attendance was big again. Where you contrast that maybe to West Brom at home, where I looked around and thought, oh yeah, there's a lot of empty seats here. It was kind of a club that I think if they continued down that road too far, could have lost a lot of fans. So I'm kind of glad they made that decision to U-turn on manager, and also maybe the sort of decisions that were being made in terms of moving fans and maybe adding more corporate seats and all the other decisions that were surrounding that, because clearly not consulting your fan base, who are the biggest part of a football club, is a rookie mistake.
Before I hand over to you, Connor, to talk about Clermont, really good point, Adam. I hadn't even particularly thought about mentioning it, but I remember when they called out the attendance for the last game, thinking the numbers are back up. And actually, we made a big point of it, didn't we? About, like you said, that West Brom game and the impact of Norwich City, and how the worst thing that can happen in football. And for as much as perhaps we mock them for it, it happened at Ipswich Town. It's the biggest tell in football that when people stop caring and stop turning up, that is when a relationship is broken. That is when action needs to be taken. And actually, by Norwich's standards, it was a drastic drop off because there's almost been this pride of how Norwich retain season tickets and how it's always above 26,000, how Carrow Road is always 95, 96, 97% full, no matter what the weather is, no matter what league they're in, no matter who they're playing. But watching that drop slowly was really alarming. And actually now it's picked back up for me. When you're looking at my final note, which we'll get onto at some point, of hope for 2026, you like to think, okay, there is something that fans and, you know, people in general are buying into. And, you know, the last point I want to make before I hand over to you, Connor, is with Clement, it feels like he is putting into effect and actually showing sort of, you know, bearing fruit from the actions that Liam Manning promised. So what was the key word? Behaviours, structure, identity. It feels like Clement has talked about it a little bit, but actually the main difference is just that we've seen that, and that comes through discipline and leadership. And clearly in terms of their careers, Clement has come from somewhere where he is experienced in managing a club of, well, far bigger than Norwich City, whereas for Liam Manning it was the reverse. This was too big of a job for him. With Clement, he stepped in and almost has a point to prove, and it's refreshing to see, isn't it? It's nice to see someone with as much experience and as much skill in the game as Clement almost take, and I don't think it's harsh to say, a step down, because all of the clubs prior to Norwich City are far bigger. But Liam Manning, it was just the opposite, wasn't it? It was the talk of, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? With Clement, it feels like there is an idea and there has been execution so far. It's not been perfect, and I know you'll say that kind of when we talk about Clement, but there is something to get behind. So, Mr. Southwell, Philippe Clement, is he doing it for you?
Yeah, I think he's restored hope, hasn't he? I think that was the big bit, like Adam spoke about. It was such a broken football club before in terms of the relationship with supporters, and sometimes that can be a little bit simplistic because it can just mean you're not winning games. But I actually think it did run deeper than that for the reasons that we've covered. And you know, to pick that up in the state that it was and to make it function and competitive in the Championship, we just see Norwich play some of the most informed teams in the division, and you know, got a really positive result against Southampton. Sheffield United, I think they were a little bit fortunate on the night, but they got a draw there. Preston likewise. They've been competitive in all of these games, and I think what he's brought has been organisation and structure to them and clarity. I think seemingly as well, we can talk about players individually who have had a real uplift in performance. I'll be honest, I don't think the last three have been quite as good as the three that preceded them, and that is, I think, something to keep an eye on, because we hear so much about managerial bounces, and I'm not hugely a subscriber to the view that exists and that's a thing. But there has been a slight regression for me in their three performances, particularly on the ball. I think off the ball he's made them a lot better. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, because he came in and they were 5 points adrift. Then they're now 4. So actually, in terms of the ground they've made up, it's not been that much. But their performances have been better. And as Adam said, they've left a lot of points out there. That Oxford game where they conceded, so I mean, it's scandalous, really. They didn't win that game as to how dominant they were in that. QPR, I thought they were good. Watford, we're probably walking away saying they should have got at least a point, but probably edged that game in terms of the chances they created. Sheffield United, even though I've just said that, Amanka Forson in the last minute, 1-on-1, huge opportunity to take 2 more points from that game. Southampton as well, I think, again, Southampton started brightly, but that's probably their headline performance under Clement, isn't it, in terms of the performance. And Preston, again, I didn't think it was a great game. I thought a point was probably fair, but I thought Preston created the better opportunities in that chart, and I thought they were not great, to be honest, but won that game courtesy of a fortunate ball dropping for Makama. And then Watford, again, I thought it was a travesty that either team won that game, because it was terrible. But the fact that if it's 0-0, you have to find a way to make sure it ends 0-0 and that you don't lose it. And that kind of felt a little bit like what we experienced pre-Clement, which is Norwich in marginal games, not gains, had found a way to lose them as well. So yeah, lots of points they could have got. Some games where maybe they took points where they shouldn't have done. But I think, to me, it shows the state they were in. The fact that Clement has come in, given them this uplift. They've lost 3 of 9, I think, of his first 9, and they're still 4 points adrift. That shows the absolute mess they were in beforehand, and the scale of task that they've got as well. Funny enough, you mentioned 08-09 earlier. I looked at that as you were speaking in terms of the points that they had. They had 26 points at this stage of that season, only to go on and get relegated, which I think is, what have they got now, 21? So I think 5 more than they've got currently. So there's a lot of work to do, and they're going to need to probably find an extra gear from what they found already in terms of results, and maintaining that kind of points per game record that they need. If you subscribe to 50, I think they could probably do about 47 this season and stay in the division. But that would be probably unnecessarily tight. So he's got a big job on his hands, but I think primarily in the opening weeks it was about repairing some of those relationships and just injecting some confidence. And I think he's done that. Now this is the bigger challenge where the novelty has worn off. He's not a fresh voice anymore. His ideas aren't fresh. There needs to be now some consistency beyond that. That's now the next
step, isn't it? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And if we get that, then I think there's all the reason to be excited by them. But hopefully they don't regress to what we were seeing beforehand.
So, gents, moving on. 2026. There is the chance to just, and again, it's a lesson for life, isn't it? You get to hit the reset button. Because of this weird construct we've made up called time, where magically things just reset and new ideas can be drawn up and implemented, and it very much applies to the footballing world. I feel like from what you're both saying with Clement, we're happy with the impact he's made, but as you said, Connor, it's the next step that now needs to be taken for you, Adam. What is the ideal scenario? What is that next step? What do you want to see?
I think probably maintaining the positive home form, 10 points from a possible 15, but quite easily and plausibly, again, could have comfortably been more for the reasons we've already spoken about. The Oxford game was minutes away from being a victory last night. Again, an opportunity where they could have and quite easily should have got at least a point as a bare minimum. I think if they can sustain that sort of level of points over the course of between now and the end of the season, then that really does give them a platform to build on, because then they've already showed that kind of steel, I guess, away from home, where they have got it in them to dig and fight and grab the odd point in difficult environments, difficult places to go. And that hopefully might be a recipe for survival this season, which is the absolute key. Clearly, the January transfer window opening is an opportunity for Norwich to invest in areas where they look light and weak. Certainly, creativity and width-wise, we've spoken about a lot on this channel previously. Maybe being an area where we feel that Norwich need to strengthen in, and I think that's probably where I then look at all of that coming together and have a feeling, and I feel they've got enough in the tank then to sort of scrap their way out of this and survive, which didn't really, certainly wasn't what I was hoping to be thinking at sort of the start of the season, but that's where we're at the moment. And that is the bare minimum and the requirement for Norwich City. If not, I think disaster strikes and they end up in League One.
My wish, before we get on to sort of January and both sides of the points that I want to make in terms of transfers, but also who's making those decisions, I would like to get to the 90th minute of a game and my legs to not just start shaking. This theme of getting to 90, and whether it's like, for example, Southampton, where they saw out that victory just superbly, my legs and nerves were shot. And the whole, even though they didn't put the ball in our half once in that period, I still was sat there watching it like, oh God, oh God, oh God. And then we get to Preston, where actually because of Southampton, I felt a little bit better. And then they concede. And the Watford goal, as you said, Connor, you put that brilliantly. No one deserved to win that game. It's an absolute farce that someone did, and it was just such an unlucky and brutal nature. I think Philippe Clement said, didn't he? It's like sort of it's a crushing blow, really, in terms of the match and that experience. But it would be lovely to be able to see out a performance. And actually, what I want to see now is Norwich win some games that they deserve to win, because there has been a little bit of there has been a touch of Liam Manning in his early spell at Norwich for those away games where points are picked up and you think, I don't quite know how I feel about that. What I would love to see is a Norwich City team, like the Southampton game, go out, deserve to win and win. Charlton as well, for me, and to not be having these discussions about Preston, where it's, well, they weren't great, they should have won, but they didn't win. Watford, I think they played better against Watford than what they did against Charlton, and they lost the game. Like it's all very confusing. But for you, Connor, clearly reinforcements are needed. Before we get into it, because we're going to have to talk about positions. How do you feel about Ben Napper leading the line? And I appreciate you've got skin in the game and you've got professionalism to maintain, and actually you've probably got a personal relationship with him that you need to maintain. But just talk to me, because I mean, my feeling, hasn't wavered of I don't want him at my football club. Where do you sit as someone who probably definitely looks at Norwich City under a finer microscope than I?
Yeah, I get that. I get that view, and I don't think you're alone in having that, and you're perfectly entitled to it. Absolutely, and I'm sure if you put that to Ben Napper, as some people did in his media round, there's not a lot that he can push back on, right? In terms of what the last year have been. Norwich 23rd in the Championship, they're 4 points adrift. Whoever is overseeing that should be in trouble, and should be in the operative word. But I also think, again, you kind of said it earlier, I believe there are some good players in this Norwich team individually, and we spoke about the recruitment generally as well. And recruitment is one of the most difficult things when you're in this job, or when you do what you guys do on podcasts, and to try and assess it, because you can only assess it as a snapshot in time. And Josh Sargent, a really good example of that. If you did it in the Premier League, you view that as a very different signing to what you do in the Championship and the context around it. And we will be doing the same in years to come with a lot of these players. We've done a lot of it in the last few weeks with Palamatson, with Jovan Makama, with, I don't know, I'm sure there's others we could put in there as well. There's been a big debate about Vladan Kovacevic as well, hasn't there? There's been plenty around all of the signings, and I would agree with kind of what you said earlier. I think I think Norwich have shown that they can spot talent. I don't think that's really in debate. You look at the players as individuals. For me, that's one part of it. I think there are multiple strands to recruitment, in that identifying players and identifying talented players is one, but then they have to be talented players in your context, in the team that you are building. And if you have a team that is built around a certain idea, it's very easy then to have those red lines over what players should and shouldn't go in that mix. And to me, it just feels like they've, and again, I don't know this for a fact, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, but what it has felt like this season is, he's a really talented player individually, let's sign him. And they've got too many of those players, and that for me probably is underpins where they are in terms of their overall lack of strategy, or kind of inability to communicate that. Because and this is on Napper, and again, something I put to him at the time, in that all it's kind of felt like to me has been the message over the last couple of years is, Norwich City are a football club that sign young players, try and develop them, sell them. That I don't really know what the how behind it, how they do that, the substance, what their football looks like, how they want to play, what sort of coach they want, and all of that stuff I think is quite challenging for fans then, because equally these players who are improving and you want to try and build a connection with, well, if they do too well, they're off. So it's a really, and to an extent that's always been the case, but to have that kind of laid out so explicitly, I think is really interesting, and also challenging as well in equal parts. So to kind of put that into January, I think for me, what's been the hardest line is that strategy is not going to change. They're going to go young again. They're going to go overseas again. And with that comes the risks of players that don't sort of make an impact straight away, which in their context at the moment is going to be difficult, because if they sign 4 players and all of them are Mate Juraseks, or all of them are even Rory McConvilles and Jacob Wrights last season, where they took a bit of time to get going, they're going to be in trouble for long deep into this season. So I'd like to see probably a little bit more balance in terms of the business that they do, maybe some more kind of prime year players. I think often when we talk about experience, we talk about players who are like 30 plus. That's not necessarily what I mean. I think players who more are in the peak years, although in the summer there was a lot more of that in terms of Kovacevic, Medic, and others as well that they signed. So for me, they've just got to be clever. I don't think it's going to be as drastic a window as maybe people hope for. I think it's probably going to be more targeted signings and fewer of them. And yeah, it's simple for me. And this is, I guess, one thing that this situation provides. It's clarity. It's got to work. They've got to be players that hit the ground running and that perform now, not in 3-4 years, because they could be in League One then. These are players that need to come in and make a tangible impact to what Philippe Clement is doing in the Championship. And if they don't, then this window, irrespective of how good those players may well go on to be, is going to be considered a failure. So in that sense, that should give them absolute clarity of what is required. But now they've got to go and execute it. And that has been the challenge, I think, in terms of getting that balance right.
Adam, do you feel like with Clement almost under Napa, there is that reason to maybe feel like Napa can learn? Because learning in football is such a difficult thing to do, because no matter what role you're in, you're never really afforded the right amount of time, for right or wrong reasons. With Clement, do you feel like, because with Manning it was the polar opposite, and it's the point I made earlier that Liam Manning was stepping up into a much bigger club where he had no experience of managing a club of Norwich City size. Sorry if there's any Bristol City fans listening, but with Clement, he's taking that step down, and he has that experience of not necessarily building clubs, because he's never spent a massive period at just one club, but actually his name, his pull, his experience, and his clearly much better understanding of football. Not technically, not domestically, but with Rangers, that sort of culture is actually much more similar to England and the Championship specifically than it is at Monaco or at Bruges. Do you feel a little bit more hopeful that actually with Clement, that Ben Napa can, one, have a little bit of direction with his signings, but two, learn the lesson in terms of how to sign and how to continue building a squad?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Clement definitely has a lot larger pull, I guess, in terms of an individual. He's somebody I think I would want to probably go and play under if you're maybe sort of someone who is kind of considering options, and maybe, you look at Norwich's position, you would be like, oh, I don't know if I fancy that. But when you've got Philippe Clement there, and Norwich have kind of got that sample size of, look, this is what he's managed to do in this short space of time with a group of individuals, some of which he probably will feel sort of in a position where he wants to carry them into the future. Yeah, I feel like that's an opportunity that the Norwich have got to take this January window and almost utilise that pull. And he clearly, having worked in different places across Europe and sort of big clubs, he will definitely have an understanding of players maybe overseas that previously other managers won't have. Liam Manning predominantly had worked with British players. Clement has kind of worked with a vast amount of different nationalities, and sort of managed to weld that together and get results at every single club he's been at. And I think that's probably where I look at it and think, yeah, if we can kind of try and use that experience and let that sort of be kind of a pillar almost of the way we recruit in January, then I think there's more reason to be excited than, sort of that sort of, I guess, feeling in the back of your mind that, you could be let down again with another transfer window under Ben Napa.
Well, with Clement, he almost has that over Manning in terms of producing players that then get sold for substantial fees. You look at his time at Monaco, that probably is the the club where, and he's referenced it in his time at Norwich, where players go from A to B to C to D, and I mean that in a positive sense. Some massive names going for big fees, and actually, hopefully, that can play. I mentioned earlier, I want to hear players talk about Clement and the impact he had on whether they signed or not. That for me makes me think, yeah, okay, maybe that will reoccur. Connor, signings, positions, where do you sit?
Wingers. I think that's
but why
that's
wingers? Tell me a little bit more about why, because I feel the same, but like I'm not quite. I don't know. It almost feels like I don't know. I just don't. I can't quite put my finger on it.
Different profiles. They need pace desperately in that team. They don't have any pace, particularly with Papa Amadou Diallo out. I think they need two different profiles. I think they need another creative midfielder. I think they need another central midfielder to offer some depth behind McLean and Matson, because with Topic out and seemingly Jacob Wright now being a 10, I don't think they've got enough options in there, and certainly enough quality options that allow you to rotate them. We saw McLean hobbling a bit towards the end of the game last night, and there's just not that option to rotate at the moment. So I think they need another one there. But look, I think last night gives you the biggest answer you need on why wingers. They ended the game with Jack Stacey and Liam Gibbs in wide areas. And if you want to get results in the Championship, you look at what Watford brought off the bench in terms of Irakunda and the pace and the difference that he made ultimately to win that game for Watford, primarily with that one bit of quality and the cutback. that for me is the priority. Wingers, they need 2 of them, and they need them pretty quickly.
Do you just to sort of bounce back to you, Connor? Gibson and Stacey ending up on the wing. Obviously, we had a little bit of a flavour of Jack Stacey in left wing. Oh my God, who was it we played before Watford? I've completely blanked on it.
Cholhan.
We obviously had a flavour of Jack Stacey in left wing, which is just a horror show, and I never want to see that ever again. With Gibbs on the left and Stacey on the right, do you think obviously it's because of the sort of depletion of Norwich, and as you say, there is a lack of wingers, but do you think that is a message to Ben Napper upstairs to say, look, mate, sort it out, or this is going to be the future?
Well, by nature of it happening, yes, but I don't think that was its intention, because Norwich were trying to win that game. They went to 2 up front. I actually felt that had a detrimental effect to what they did. They took Jacob Wright off for me, and Schwartau as well. And Schwartau's been excellent, but I think he's a number 10. I don't think he's a winger long term. But yeah, I guess I don't think Philippe Clement did put those 2 players in those positions as a message upwards, because Norwich are in too precarious a situation to be doing that and playing those type of games. I think it was a situation where it was more, right, what have I got on the bench? How do I make something out of nothing, really? Which is why I think, you can. I've seen a little bit of discourse on it in terms of the subs being wrong, and look, maybe they were. But I also think that's reflective of the squad. And Adam made the point earlier that the Tony Springett story has been fantastic, where he's come from to getting back into the team. Really lovely lad, been through a hell of a lot, from a point where he couldn't really walk to being a starter again in the Championship. Wonderful story, wonderful guy, cares deeply about Norwich. But to be in a situation where you spent the money they have, and for him to kind of be a starting choice, I think that is slightly reflective, without being too harsh, of where they've gone a little bit wrong in recruitment. So, and I think for me, when I looked at that, and again, not just him, because I think he does have pace, and I think he does offer you something slightly different, but I just think the variation and the quality primarily in those positions that they're just short on. I mean, Matej Jurasek, I think, showed glimpses against Charlton of the level of technical quality he would have, but that clearly just hasn't happened, has it, in terms of a consistent run? So, yeah, obviously Diallo coming back will help that. I still think they need to, and I felt they needed another one in the summer. So it's not particularly hindsight or a surprise that they've ended up here. Yeah, that for me feels like the priority. And then, yeah, if you can get a central midfielder, if you can get a more creative type, maybe that could be one of your wingers, and you double that up as someone who can play out wide, but is also maybe a bit more kind of a natural number 10. I think that, to me, would feel like what they need. I know they were thinking about going for a fullback. I think that's sort of on ice now because of Callum Fisher's performances over recent weeks, which have been tremendous. And obviously with Krezene and Mahovo back as well, I think has eased some of those concerns. So, yeah, I don't necessarily see fullback being an area centre-back. They feel pretty well stocked to me, unless they were to lose Duffy or Medic. Goalkeeper, don't see that. So I think we're looking really at a striker. I don't see that with the 3 that they've got. So, yeah, wide areas and midfield, I think, is probably the area I'm looking at this month.
Well, you've brilliantly covered absolutely everything there, so I'm not going to put you on the spot, Adam, and say, what do you think in terms of the profile of player? I just want to ask, how do you think Norwich should go about it? Do you expect big fees? And when I say big fees, we're talking Eurosec fees, 6, 7, 8 million quid, or Premier League loans, because it is tricky with, and I'll be honest with you, I think Toplic is pony. I'm still all in on Cianat's coming good, but with those on the sideline, if you then chuck in players in those positions, you create almost a bit of in a theoretical dream. You create a bit of a headache. Do you look at that Premier League loan route? Because as far as I'm aware, Norwich haven't even touched that yet this season. How do you want Norwich to go about it, and realistically, what do you expect?
Yeah, I think the Premier League loan route is an avenue that Norwich probably haven't executed well enough or near enough of it in recent times when they have done it. I think we saw it maybe with Lewis Dobbin, last January coming in, and sort of that instant impact that he offered, a relatively, unproven maybe player who sort of had, point to prove, having sort of a difficult spell at West Brom, and that didn't turn out the way he wanted it to, and kind of arrived at Norwich and maybe the expectations weren't overly high, but he sort of soon won fans over. And clearly looking back now, and again, you know, you kind of go back to maybe that summer transfer window. He's a player who was available, somebody that Norwich had first refusal on, and they were, you know, decided to opt for other players. And that's a lad who is a winger who definitely would offer a lot to this squad for where they're at the moment. So I think that's an avenue, yeah, that I would definitely be inclined to try and utilise, just because, again, there's not that acclimatization that you kind of see maybe with a Mate Jurasek arriving from, you know, Prague in the Czech Republic and having to come into Norwich, you know, and just to life in England, living on his own and trying to get settled and all of that amidst, you know, a Norwich sort of squad and the situation they're in. They can't really afford that time for adjustment. Maybe last season they could, because I think there was maybe less of that sort of fear that they would get pulled into sort of the relegation dogfight, and maybe they would just be middling around the sort of middle of pack of the championship. And, you know, clearly maybe if things kind of continued on the trajectory they were going on, they could have got closer to it last season. But, you know, I don't think there was ever that real fear, where this time around it is about kind of that instant impact that Connor spoke about. And we need players to come in that are ready to hit the ground running and try and pull Norwich out of the mess they're in. So whatever that looks like, obviously that's going to be, you know, decided by Ben Napper. But I think that blend has got to be right, because, yeah, for the reasons you state, they've clearly got players that will return to this squad at some point, whether that's this season from the injury bench or next season. And if you've kind of brought too many players that are maybe oven ready or sort of ready to hit the ground running, then you've got the difficulty of trying to kind of, well, Clermont's got the difficulty of trying to manage that. And clearly, even now, they've got a little bit of a top-heavy squad. It's more down to injuries and maybe lack of quality in certain areas that they're going to have to go and invest heavily in January again.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Chaps, thank you. I feel like we've covered 2025 there and put out a bit of a wish list for 2026. I'm looking forward to this time next year and having a look back and assessing how the year went. My wish list, very briefly, I'd like to just stay in the league, get to the summer. Hopefully Clermont's in charge. Hopefully we're still in the championship. Hopefully Ben Napper's learnt his lessons and we can reflect on some decent January signings and then go from there, because that's as far as we could possibly look forward. I know there was excitement when Clermont took over and we saw that drastic improvement in performance and this idea of how easy it is to get into the playoffs. But I mean, between the three of us, I don't think we've quite reached that level of delusion yet. Hopefully one day we can again. But that is what I'd like to see. And I'm just glad that Carrow Road is not as unpleasant as it had been for such a long time. I mean, not just under Liam Manning, but towards the end of Thorup's period. I mean, I wasn't actually at the Portsmouth game, and I'm almost glad I wasn't. But Carrow Road again feels like it's united, which is something that, you know, we always love about Norwich City. It's the consistency and the loyalty of supporters. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. Chaps, as I said, thanks. I just want to say thanks to people who've watched, listened, liked, subscribed, all of that stuff. I've had an absolute blast doing this year, picking this up again and talking about Norwich City. It's certainly not been boring. And I know it will continue to have its ups and downs, but I very much look forward to doing it again next year. If you want to subscribe, please do. My final message, have a happy and healthy start to, or if you're listening to it in 2026, I hope you've had a happy and healthy start to the new year. And yeah, we'll see you again soon.